Hello, hello. As Edith said, I'm Sylvia Miles from the Church of the Good Shepherd in Galax. After I retired as a pharmacist for 45 years, I moved to Virginia. And I since then have become a Lutheran lay preacher and am currently in my second year of the Lutheran Synod authorized ministry. I just had my interview with Pastor Bear Derrick and Pastor Wanda Childs, and they let me go on. I get to finish, and I'm so excited. um, as I introduce my talk about Phoebe, who, by the way, the reason I volunteered for this is because I named my newest kitty Phoebe, and I wanted to make sure I knew everything about Phoebe. I would encourage you to study an artist rendering of an icon of Phoebe and think about what she might have really looked like. Phoebe is mentioned only once in the scriptures in two verses, Romans 6, 1 through 2. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church of Cenchreae, so that you may welcome her in the Lord, as is fitting for the saints, and help her in whatever she may require from you. For she has been a benefactor of many, and of myself as well. You see, Phoebe was a diakonos, Greek for a deacon and benefactor, in the church of Cenchreae in Greece near Corinth. In the mid-50s, Paul commended her to the church in Rome as one who, through her service, looked after many people, including himself. Phoebe had a leadership position in the church in Greece and likely carried Paul's letter to the church in Rome, shared it aloud, and interpreted it for the gathered followers of Jesus. Right now, before I begin, I'd like to make some attributions. The icon of Phoebe that you saw is from the Know Your Mothers project. This project works to uncover stories of women that we all should know. As part of their work, they create icons of these women. And I encourage you to go to their website, and you can see all the icons. You'll find out what Bathsheba and Jezebel look like. Um, it is very interesting, and they were very generous to let me use their rendering. The second attribution I'd like to make is to Susan Hyland. She wrote the book that just came out this year called, guess what? Finding Phoebe. What New Testament women were really like. The author uses historical context, scriptural evidence, and our own questions that we ask to challenge our modern preconceptions of what women in the New Testament were really like. She validates her conclusions through incredible scholarship, looking through records, tax documents, receipts, studying the customs. We need to recognize that Rome was the occupying force. Roman customs and traditions and laws heavily influenced the cultures of Egypt, the Jewish nations, the believers in the New Testament, Jews and Gentiles alike. And when you hear their customs described, you'll understand why Jesus really was turning their world upside down. While the Jews were granted permission to retain their own worship practice, they were often forced to abide by the laws and customs of Roman society. She also used numerous inscriptions found particularly on buildings that described the women that sponsored those buildings. She looked at old letters and just notes that people sent to each other. and of course studied the laws that governed the folks that lived during that time. How do we deduce who Phoebe really was? For instance, was Phoebe Jewish? I never thought of that before. Someone asked me that the other day. We think she was probably Greek by her name and by where she came from. Why does Phoebe matter to us today? We'll answer that a little later. And I ask you, do you think maybe this will help us figure out who many of the unnamed women of the New Testament might have been? I have found it really enlightening, especially when comparing it to the two um, presentations that we've already had about other women. First, to know who Phoebe was, we can go to Paul's description of her. It's really important to think of the words that he uses to describe her and try to think about what it meant in their culture. Did it mean something different than it means to us? The words that jumped out to me were deacon, benefactor, and patron. Sometimes deacon is translated as minister. Some people have even translated it as helper. Most scholars think that if Paul meant helper, he probably would have used the more common word, doulos, if that's what he really meant. I think perhaps the use of helper might show a little gender bias in the people translating. Being a deacon tells you a lot about Phoebe's character. Paul describes the qualifications for a deacon in 1 Timothy. A deacon is a serious, honest, temperate, faithful person. Phoebe was indeed a servant leader. It's interesting to note in that description that Paul makes no distinctions between male and female deacons. When we say that Phoebe was a benefactor, or some people say patron, it's from the word prostatos in Greek and can be translated as ruler or manager and protector or champion. It implies service and generosity. She probably had her own wealth to be able to financially help people. And because it seems she had the ability to travel, she was going to go to Rome. The word commended, Paul commended Phoebe. He meant that he thought he was recommending her as qualified for the task he was giving her. Not only qualified, but worthy. She was qualified to read, to interpret, and to clarify the letter that Paul was sending to Rome. To be able to do that probably meant that she was well educated. I think she may have even helped Paul write the letter to Romans, for all we know. She might have been the very first editor in the New Testament. But today, we have a title for such a person as Phoebe, the person that can stand before a congregation, communicate with oral skill, and clarify the message of the scripture. That title is preacher. The Know Your Mother's Project calls her the mother of preachers. Susan Hyland notes that minds will probably not be changed by finding out who Phoebe really was. If you thought women should not be pastors, this presentation will probably not change your mind, and vice versa. However, for many, myself included, finding out who Phoebe was has given me and all of us a role model and an inspiration. Now, I would kind of like to take you to Susan Hyland's book, Finding Phoebe, what New Testament women were really like. It's not really a book about Phoebe. I was so shocked when I got into it. What is really a book about was what life was like for women in the New Testament. She teaches us to be a detective and figure out from scripture and extra biblical sources what these women must have really been like. The book is divided into 4 sections. It deals with women and wealth and property. It deals with women and social influence and status. It deals with the virtues of women, and as well the speech that women were allowed to have. And I'm sure we all have some really preconceived notions about what that was like. You should know that in the Roman life, it was very common for women to own property. In fact, women owned about 1/3 of all the property across the Roman Mediterranean territories. That's actually the same proportion of land that women own now on our earth. A women's property ownership was not unregular. It was an expected part of the cultural landscape. Many Christians today have the impression that women were under the legal control of their fathers until they married, at which point they came under the legal control or the legal authority of their husbands. This does misrepresent the legal status of women in the New Testament. Kind of shocking, isn't it? While it is true that daughters were under the legal authority of their fathers, the same authority applied to their brothers as well. The event that changed a person's legal status wasn't marriage, it was the death of the father. When he died, both son and daughter became legally independent. Both law and custom agreed that fathers should give their property in roughly equal proportions to their children. However, it seems that there was a bias toward the sons, and they inevitably got a little more. The evidence we have suggests that women in Greece, Asia Minor, Judea, and Egypt also owned property. There was property ownership by very wealthy people and also by women of just average means. The historical sources also validate that women from Jewish heritage and New Testament women also owned property. And you'll notice that when we studied Lydia and when we studied Tabitha, we made some assumptions. From Lydia, we concluded that she may have been wealthy for several reasons. You know, she probably was an owner of a purple clothing business, or at least, an outstanding partner. She had a large house that she invited the disciples to, and her household was baptized with her. So that meant that she was in charge of all of them. As for Tabitha, we concluded that she was probably of lesser means, but she did seem to have a business. I'm not sure how profitable it was because it did seem that she gave away so much of her business. So it's beyond us at this point. Now you may ask, were men actually the real property managers and women only the owners on paper? The short answer to that question is that women owned their own property and made decisions about what was to be done with that property. The wealthiest women often sponsor grand building projects and community events. Less wealthy women took part in their local economies, working in the markets, that kind of thing, and in cultural practices like cemeteries, setting up, the burial grounds. Managing property and managing household affairs were, in fact, women's jobs, women's work. Married women often were responsible for supervising their husband's property as well as their own. And one of the situations that the author presented was a note that the woman of the major household sent to women in a sort of satellite property, instructing them on how they were to manage that property there. So perhaps she was managing her husband's property. We don't really know, but it is great evidence of what women were actually doing. Was Phoebe married? We do not know. Whether or not a woman was married, she became the owner of her property once her father died. Romans viewed the property of husbands and wives as legally separate. And they wrote a number of laws to reinforce that. One of the laws had to do with dowries. A dowry was given and was maintained under the control of the husband. The husband was allowed to use and benefit from that dowry, but both the law and society viewed the dowry as belonging to the wife. In fact, the husbands had to return their dowries if the couple divorced. It's kind of shocking, isn't it? When we look at women in the New Testament, we know from our presentation last night that most women worked hard. There was considerable labor involved in running a household and a property. And women did many kinds of work. Some of the most prominent kinds, of course, number one was child rearing. About half of all children died before the age of 5. On average, a woman was pregnant in her lifetime 5 or 6 times. But there were occupations like wet nurses. Now, wet nurses didn't just feed the babies, they taught and nurtured them as well. They were elementary and secondary teachers. They managed the household, not only the feeding and clothing of household members. And we saw last night how very difficult it must have been to clothe all those folks. But they also managed all the business and social endeavors of the family. Wives handled matters regarding her entire family's livelihood. Owning property became an opportunity for women to develop a business, using her land as a resource. She could have had a business dyeing purple cloth. She could have had a business making bricks from her property. Wealthier households exploited the labor of enslaved peoples, and the women managed those people. But women had all kinds of occupations. The stories of the New Testament don't really give us any indication of what kind of work they did, but they also did things like being hairdressers, personal servants, textile workers, working in the market, um, selling products. Some women owned restaurants and ran them. Some were midwives. Some were doctors and healers. And there were even women gladiators and athletes. Now, when we say that Phoebe was a patron, we do have to recognize that the patron system was very common in the first century, and patrons were both men and women. Social interactions of the New Testament period were strongly shaped by the parent-client relationships. In a nutshell, lower class people or clients made ties with patrons, people of a higher status, who could help them out. Patrons provided assistance in things like political influence, making loans, securing business connections, writing letters of introduction. They also had social connections and influence to offer them. In return, clients showed honor to their patrons. The value of that honor was that it improved the patient's social status. This was a very status-oriented society. Now, people were not only patrons of cities, of individuals, but of cities and civic groups. The social norm encouraged people with property to use it for the sake of their families and for their communities at large. Even though many men were patrons, it does turn out that the role of patron was very much understood to be a part of women's work, running the household. In many cases, the New Testament doesn't specify what kind of work, what kind of support that women gave to Jesus, all of the, or the Jesus movement. We hear their names somewhat, but we don't really know what they did. And we have to fill in those gaps based on our cultural knowledge and historical information, as we did last night when we talked about Lydia and her religion and her impact on the Jesus movement. Now, we have said that Phoebe was educated, probably well educated. It seems that people during that time educated their children to the extent that they could afford, and they educated them in ways that would benefit whatever kind of work they did. Women were typically less likely to be educated than men. However, girls and boys were educated in the same schools and with the same curriculum, at least until they were about 14. Evidence suggests that many people were somewhat literate. In a Bible study the other day, I heard someone say the literacy rate was less than 10% in the Roman Empire. But many were somewhat literate. They had enough education so that they could do their job. Things like if you worked in the market, you could write out receipts, you could add and subtract the money, you could advertise for services. Education also had a really important social value. It was a sign of status and good breeding. So many people sought to increase their social standing by educating their children. Now, it's interesting that poorer families also benefited from a daughter's education. It helped her get a better job working for the family. It helped her to marry a man of higher status, which would in turn bring to the family social connections. So if a family could afford it, educating girls made a lot of sense. Now, I said that you often found out about what women were doing by looking at inscriptions on buildings. And it was very common for someone to be described as a virtuous woman. Well, what exactly is a virtuous woman? Well, in Roman times, a virtuous woman was someone who was modest, industrious, and loyal to her family. Modesty incorporates self control. That's what it really means to them, self control, and produces self discipline. It means the woman prioritized the needs of her household above her own personal pleasures, her household, and even her city. It, it was considered a virtue for both males and females and included things like dressing modestly. If you dress modestly, that meant you didn't spend a lot of money on your clothing and you could help out your city. So people would often say that you were adorned with virtue rather than riches. Um, it also involved sexual restraint. To be faithful to one's spouse then required control over one's passions. I might add that society gave men much greater sexual license than they gave women. Modesty or self control helped develop good judgment. The same judgment needed to sustain a stable household also formed the foundation of a stable society. So many women became leaders in their cities. Um, and it wasn't any kind of contradiction of social norms for them to be the mayor. Um, it is said that it is a virtue to be industrious. Well, they had a phrase, a saying, when they made attributions to women. They would say she was a worker in wool. Whether she ever actually worked in wool or not, it was an idiom used to honor her as someone who fulfilled the traditional virtue of working hard for your family. Loyalty was an action taken out of devotion to one's family, one's city, or the gods. Women's woolworking then also indicated their loyalty to their family. The society placed a premium on marital harmony, the working together. I found it interesting that the gold standard for a good marriage was the wise husband who could lead his household without the use of force. The New Testament language comes across as much more restrictive about wives than what seems likely to have been the actual practice. And I found that heartening. In my last minute or so, I'd like to talk a little bit about women being told to be silent. Well, indeed, the ideal, not just in the New Testament, was that husbands are the public voice of the family and wives should defer to them. However, bold speech by women on behalf of one's city or family was often seen as virtuous, and speech of women was not forbidden. Women certainly spoke in their work when raising children, teaching, running the household. Women prayed in temples and homes and arenas. Women were were oracles and prophets of Jewish and other Greek and Roman deities. In the New Testament period, silence was seen as an aspect of self-control. Speaking wisely meant knowing what to say, but also meant knowing when to be silent. Keeping quiet in the right circumstances conveyed wisdom and self-discipline. And think about this. If women were not allowed to speak in public as a rule, it was still a rule that would have been applied to the cultural norms, which means they spoke about their areas of expertise. I'm sorry we don't have, I think, a lot of time for questions, but I would advise you to ask your deacons in your next breakout period.